YouTube family, welcome back to a new hour-long painting lesson. Today we're going to be painting this underwater seascape. And this is something that I'm fairly excited to do because we haven't done a lot of it here on the channel. We did a couple of quick small ones about a year ago, but we've never really dived in, pardon the pun, and today we are doing just that. We're doing so because it was actually voted for by the patrons over on the Alpine level, and I would like to say thank you to all of you for participating in the poll, for having your voices heard, and for deciding on us doing this lesson here today. It's not something I would innately think to do myself, so I'm really glad that you kind of asked for it and made this happen. I suppose, while I'm on the topic, if you are new to the channel and unaware, Patreon's a great way to support the channel, say thank you, but it's also a great way to get lots of additional bonus content. For starters, you can get the traceable for this to transfer this drawing onto your canvas very easily. You can also get access to our back catalog of over 50 bonus episodes where I don't post anywhere else. They're all over an hour long, and they come with traceables as well, just to help you get that drawing on the canvas. There are also fun things like our exclusive Facebook group where we all share our work, help each other, leave critiques, and grow as a community together. It's just a really fun place to talk to other artists and to learn. So I think I don't need to talk about that anymore. There's plenty more up over on Patreon. You can find a link to it in the description down below, but let's talk about the lesson here today. So to begin, here I have my canvas. It is 9 by 12 inches. The drawing on it was done with these woodless colored pencils. I like them because they allow me to allocate different colors to my subjects. So here my seaweed is in a green, some of my caves and things are in a blue, my seahorse is more in a red, and it just makes it a lot more easily discernible on the canvas. Here I have a small dish of water to clean my brushes. Here I have my little painting cloth to wipe off my excess paint and water. This is a picture frame I'm using as a painting palette. I like it because it's just very easy to clean and the paint doesn't absorb into it. Now in regards to brushes, I'm using a very limited number of them today. Make it easy, but I also don't think we need that many. So to begin, here I have my larger flat-headed brush. It is 2 centimeters wide, great for blocking in large areas and creating sharp edges. Then I have my medium, oh, I'm dropping it. I have my medium-sized square-headed brush, and this one is only 1 centimeter, so it's great when we want to work in slightly more detailed areas. Then finally, I have my small flat-headed brush. This one is only 1/2 centimeter, and this is great for the really detailed areas, much like our seahorse there. Now, to the left-hand side of the painting, you'll see 2 painting pigments. That is a Mars Black and a Titanium White. Now, you've seen the thumbnail, you know this turns into a very vibrant painting, but I'm going to begin the painting with an achromatic palette and layer. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take those 2 pigments, I'm going to mix a lot of different grays, use the blacks, use the whites, and I'm going to paint a base layer on this. And I'm going to do that because it's going to help me allocate depth very simply. When you're painting depth and 3-dimensional subjects in paintings, you're essentially wrapping light around subjects. So you're creating these gradients, having that light work its way on top, and that's very easy to do when you're only working with 2 pigments because you can see something getting brighter or darker. But when you start working in color, you don't simplify it at all, you make it much more complicated because then we're working with all these preconceived notions that we have of what colors are bright, what colors are dark, despite the fact that all colors have bright and dark variants, and it complicates it. So what we're going to do, we're going to paint it all to begin with white and black. Then, once it's completely dry, I'm going to do a glazed layer and add on all of my color right there. So we're kind of splitting the painting process in half. That way we really get to focus on creating depth and 3-dimensional subjects. Then we really get to focus on color and not have the 2 kind of conflict and make each other harder. I'll do a full demonstration of how to glaze, so don't you worry about that. But this is a really fun painting process. It's great for beginners, and it's also great for people like me who have been painting for over a decade, but still find it to be just an incredibly useful way of painting, and it makes the paintings and the depth so much more natural. So, with that said, that's what we're working on here today. Let's actually start and have some fun. So to begin here today, I'm going to take my larger flat-headed brush, which again is 2 centimeters wide, and I'm going to take it and dip the tip of it in my water. This is going to condense my bristles, help me extend the wet life of my paint, and drag it out a bit farther. But I don't want it to be fully wet or it'll thin the paint too much, so I'm wiping off my excess water and just allowing it to remain damp. Then, I'm going to take some of my Mars Black here, and I'm going to move it to the right-hand side of my palette. I'm going to try to make this side more the darker side of my palette, this side more the brighter side, and this will help me kind of just keep things organized. So here I have my Mars Black paint. Now I'm going to head over here. I'm going to grab just a little bit to begin with of titanium white, and I want to create a relatively dark gray to begin with. And once I have that, take a little bit more titanium white, I'm going to apply this to my background. And especially right down here. I like to begin painting all of my paintings with the background because they are easy to layer on top of. We don't have to worry about working around the details of our foreground for the most part, and it's just a much more linear way of painting. We start in the back and we work our way to the front. If we started in the front in our main subjects and then we started painting the background, we'd have to be very detail-oriented, making sure we don't go over any of the finely painted foreground subjects. For the background, it's much more loose generally, and it's okay to kind of paint over the foreground loosely as well. So, with that said, here you can see I'm just painting around my edge. I'm using the very sharp edge of my brush to get this out on the canvas. And I'm starting with this dark color predominantly at the bottom here. Now, we can't just paint this individual color, right? We need to build some depth. So, at the bottom of the ocean, here, there's not going to be much light because there's just too much water to pass through. So what I'm going to need to do here is now switch to a slightly brighter pigment to work upward. So I'll take a little bit more titanium white. I'll mix that in. We don't want too much. And then I'll start applying that on top and blending that in. So it's a very easy process. Take a little bit more titanium white as we get a little bit higher. Just like that. Now we don't want it to be actually bright because we're still underwater. We don't want this to be too bright, but we want it to be brighter than what we had down here. So I'm progressively just going to continue that. Now we didn't finish this side, so I'm going to take a little break, move over there, take that dark pigment, and as you can see, I'm working around all of these little drawings. But I'm also okay if I cover them up and I redraw them in a little bit. I can always go back to the start of the video, see exactly where they are, or use the traceable. I also have the option of kind of just making it up a little bit later on. So I'm not too worried about it, but I'm going to try to preserve as much detail here in the foreground as I possibly can. Now here again, I'm using the side of my brush to create these very sharp lines. And then I kind of blend upwards a little bit with that tapping motion. Right here, you'll notice that it gets fairly thick and then the pigment's more thin. That's because we added a little bit too much water there and the paint is semi-transparent. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to add more water to my brush right now. Just clean off those bristles. I don't want any paint drying on here. Then I'm going to dry my brush fairly well here down on my cloth. So I'm just running it back and forth. I'm not pressing it into the cloth as that'll hurt the bristles. I'm just doing this swiping motion. Then I'm going to go over this with some more thick paint. So I'll take some titanium white, move that into our Mars Black, and I'm going to mix much more paint than I did initially. That way this becomes much more pigment oriented where it might have had a little too much water from before. So if you find that your pigments are getting a little bit too thin, don't worry about it. Just clean your brush off well and then remix some of your paint with less of that water and less of a damp brush. It's important to use a damp brush because it will help you create much more shine or fine, sharp edges, but at the same time it does come at a cost, and sometimes it's just better to work in the middle. Here I'm loosely working over some of my falling foliage in the water there. And now I'm going to begin working on the slightly brighter water up top again. Covers up nice and easy. If you find that you are unable to cover up a wet area, it's probably just too wet. So let it dry entirely first and then come back to it. Here we really don't need a perfect gradient from darker to lighter because it is under the water. There are going to be all of these different currents and things kind of taking light in different ways, and brush strokes are actually a fine way of creating that. So here I'm just continuing, and if I'm going over a previously dry area, generally you'll get slightly more of a gritty effect, you'll get more of a toothy effect on the canvas, but because my brush is relatively damp still, it's not wet, it's relatively damp, it's going to help me glide over that area, and that way I don't get that harsh texture in there. There we go, just working my way around the foliage and blending. It's a great place to start in the sky or background of your painting because it's also a great place to practice, right? You're generally going to cover up a lot of the background in a painting, so by working on it first, you actually get to practice painting. So you get to develop those motor skills, remind yourself of those motor skills. That way, when you get to your main subjects, you are well practiced and you can do a really good job. Another great reason to work on that first. Now I'm going to add a little bit more light to the very top because I do want some light beams coming in here a little bit later on, and I want that to be a little bit brighter. So I'm working my way over to the left hand side, just interjecting slightly more titanium white. And I'd like to note, when I'm going to grab more paint, I'm generally using the corner of my brush to pick it up rather than all of it. That way I don't dilute all of this paint with that Mars black or vice versa. It just allows me to keep everything a little bit more clean. So there we go. Now we have a gradient, dark and light. So I'm actually going to continue using this brush, but as you can see, I'm cleaning it off quite well to begin with here. And I'm doing that because it's just really important to make sure that the pigment isn't drying in your brush, especially down here. For the most part, I'm only wetting my brush to this half point, and I'm only applying paint to maybe a third of the way up. And this is going to help me keep my brushes for a much longer period of time. So now we're going to move one step closer in the painting. We did the very background. Now we're going to be working on this landmass here and this landmass here. So this is very dark because it has almost no light getting to it. It's really in the recesses of the ocean. But here, as we get closer to our foreground, we're going to have some light shining down here. So anything close to this is going to have a lot of light, and then it's going to recede as we go into the background. So this is going to be a little bit brighter than this because it'll be getting a little bit of that light that's shining down into this area. So I'm going to take a little bit of titanium white, mix that into what we were just using. That way I know it's only a little bit brighter. I'm going to use the sharp edge of my brush here, as you can see, to map this in, just like that. And my paint right now, I wouldn't say that it's too wet, but it's definitely semi-transparent. And something you can do to tell is physically stand up, take a couple of steps back, and look at it from a different angle. When you do that, you can generally see a lot of a reflection if it's too wet, and it might actually be deceiving. So I'm going to make that less wet, but I'm also going to make it a little bit darker. As you can tell, it's by far the brightest thing here, and I want a subtle progression of brightness. So I'm going to add a little bit more Mars black. Again, I'm just taking it with the corner of my brush. And let's work that onto here. Just like that. Here I'm using the corner of my brush to work around the details of my seahorse. It's very efficient because it does have that nice sharp edge. But again, if I go over too much of it, I'm not too worried. We can always go back in and redraw it. There we are. Now we'll work it over here. As you can see, I'm really running out of paint, and so when I make an application, it is fairly gritty. You don't want that. You always want to go in with some fresh, abundant paint. So that's really what I'm doing. And here I'm just going back, I'm mixing over the area I once used. I'm letting the edge of it remain that initial color, and I'm mixing till I get something very similar. So I'm just using this corner as a reference to make sure that I remix that same value. I believe I said color earlier. I mean value. When we're talking about hues, we talk with color. When we talk about blacks, whites, and grays, we talk about the value. There we go. It's nice. Going to go back, make this slightly darker again. Now I'm going to stand up and make sure that it isn't too thin. I'm also going to judge the value of this in contrast with that. Sometimes when you're too close to something, you don't really have a good representation of the painting as a whole. You get too hyper-focused on a singular area, and that's not what we want to do here. So I'm going to stand up, take a couple of steps back, and that's exactly what I want. It's still really dark, but it's slightly brighter than the top area there. So now I'm going to clean this brush fairly well, as I'm done with it for now. And I'm going to switch to this nice medium-sized flat-headed brush. Again, this one is 1 centimeter. And I'm going to make sure that I make that fairly damp, as I did our first. I'm going to work on this area next, as it's the next step in our painting. I'm going to make it slightly brighter, so I'll take some titanium white with the corner of my brush, mix it into what we just had, and then I'll use that nice sharp edge to deliver it on the canvas. As you can see, it's a little bit toothy. I don't have enough paint, so I'll mix up some more. There we go. When you're mixing paint and you're trying to mix brighter pigments, use much more bright pigment than dark pigment to begin with, because it's much easier to make a pigment darker than it is brighter, and you'll just save yourself a lot of time and effort working in that way. There we go. Make it a hint brighter, and I'll do so predominantly at the top, because it's the top area that's going to be receiving the most light. The light's going to be coming down, it's going to be hitting the top, and then as it kind of moves farther down, less light can get there. There are also going to be more shadows, and this is how we start to create depth. So this is very simple. It's just like the sky that we have up here. The top is brighter, the bottom is much darker. There we go. Like that a lot. Now, I'm going to take a step back, and you'll notice that I do this very frequently in this process. The more I paint in the style, the more I find it useful. So, that's looking quite good. I'm now going to move on to the next area of our painting, which is right here. And, yet again, I'm going to make things slightly brighter. So, here I have my new gray. I'm using the edge of this medium-sized square-headed brush. Here I'll use the corner to paint around my little guy right here. There we go. Nice and detailed. It's great to use a flat / square-headed brush like this for details, because sometimes we tend to use very small round-headed brushes, but they don't have a lot of bristles behind them to act as a barrier and to strengthen the bristles. So when I use the corner here and it applies pressure to the canvas, it only moves back so far. But if it was very small, then it wouldn't have all of these bristles behind it, and if you pushed it, it would really move. So we can apply a little bit more pressure with this because it has all of those backing bristles. There we go. Finger is now covered in paint. It's okay. Finger painting isn't a bad thing. Now I'm going to take some more of this, work my way around the back of my seahorse here, and I'll blend that up. And soon we'll get to start painting some of the fun, natural life in the water. Here, mixing up some extra paint, started to run out, and as we know, that's not a good way to apply paint. So I'm just working around the edges first, and that's another good lesson. Whenever you're working on a subject with a sharp edge, do the edge first, and then work your way into the body or the middle area of negative space. Because when you have fresh paint, when your brush is freshly damp, then you're going to create the cleanest, sharpest of lines, and then as you continue to apply it, it's going to dry out, you're going to lose paint, and then that's when you want to move into the middle area because you don't need to be as pristine. So now let's add in some detail here. I'm going to take that same pigment, and I'm just going to kind of draw on some nice little details using the corner of my brush. Something to note here, none of these are overlapping, and that isn't natural. You want them to overlap to a point. So I'm going to take one from here and I'm going to overlap it like this. This is going to create the impression of more depth in our painting very, very simply. There we go. Can lead one in from there. And the more they kind of crisscross, the more natural it'll look. It's very much like trees. The branches don't grow to the left and to the right, they grow in all directions. They crisscross, they make all of these interesting patterns, and that's exactly what we want here. We want it to be interesting. Yet again, mixing more paint. And if my paint's slightly different each time, that is okay. A little bit of diversity will actually help the painting, but we want it to be relatively consistent here. There we go. Here I'm just covering up some areas that were a little bit thin. It's good to go back and do that every once in a while. Just make sure you have good coverage just about everywhere. And we are off to a really nice start. So yet again, I'm standing up, taking a step back, making sure that it's all going quite well. It's kind of funny seeing it like this. I can picture it in my head being this much more vibrant, bright painting, but it does need to start in these darker, more achromatic layers to really achieve that depth well. And again, can you imagine doing this and then that land mass and then that land mass and then this one, progressively making them brighter? If you also add color, it would be so much more complicated because you might be making it more saturated and not brighter, which it can be kind of confusing. But again, this eliminates that worry and that confusion. Now, if you look, this actually extends right down here, so I'm going to do that. So I'm going to mix a little bit more of that paint, but I'm going to make it slightly darker this time because we're getting farther away from that light. We have this rock casting maybe a shadow, and so I want it to be more muted and dark. So here I'm just working my way around this nice little plant and this nice rock here. Just like that. And now we'll start moving upwards. As I move up, it needs to get a little bit brighter to match this better. There we go. We'll just fill that in. It's kind of nice how that almost blends together. It feels a little bit more loose, a little bit more natural. So now it almost looks like we are at the foreground, right? We have the cave to the left, we have this area right here, so we can essentially paint whatever we want at this point, right? Not so much. Even though we're in the foreground and everything is relatively close, some things are still on top of other things. Some things are still in front of other things. So this is actually the next area we need to paint. It's still the farthest back piece of the painting. And this is something I'm going to start by making a slightly brighter edge with. So I'm going to take a little bit of a brighter gray than we've used before, and I'm just going to map this in along the edge. I don't want it to be a straight edge, I want it to be an ever-evolving edge. I want it to be nice and interesting, so I'll have some little protruding pieces like that. Just move my brush out naturally. Then I'm going to create a darker gray, and I'm going to come from behind it, blend it to a point, but allow those brush strokes to show through a little bit. They'll act as nice little rock texture. There we go. Here I'm working my way around my little bits of seaweed. Again, that doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just trying to leave a little reminder of where it is. There we go. The digital sketch, the traceable that I add up over on Patreon, it'll have the finished version of this painting. So when I change things as I go, it'll have all of those changes included. So you don't have to worry about kind of augmenting that which I've provided there. It's all as perfect as it could possibly be to the final version of the painting. Now as I get even closer, I'm going to work on this right here, and it's going to have a little bit more of a shadow cast on it from this one, and I want to make it quite dark because it's also at the very edge of the painting, which means it'll create a nice vignette. And a vignette is simply a darker edge that surrounds a photograph or image that draws the viewer's eye into the center as the eye innately goes to the brightest portion of the painting. This little guy right there is going to be very bright to draw the eye into that. So here I'm just taking a really dark gray, arguably darker than what we used back here, and I'm applying that. I started with the edges of the rock and now I'm working my way back. As I start to run out of paint in there, you can see it's much more textured. Now I'm going to take more of that, just like that, and I'm going to create some of this draping foliage. So I'm going to begin by kind of doing this tapping motion on the edge. It's a tap and then it's a drag either up into it or out from it, and I'm going back and forth with it. That way I create different implications and markings each time. If I just went the same way each time, it might become a little bit repetitive, and I don't want that. I still want it to be nice and interesting. Sometimes I'm making bigger implications, sometimes they're smaller, but I want it to be ever evolving. Now we'll go back, mix a little bit more, finish up this area, and soon we'll have a full corner of our painting done minus the color. Here I'm having some extra little draping bits, just giving it some additional detail. Here I'm moving one even farther down. Maybe this isn't a reflective piece of foliage. So the rock will probably catch light because it's a reflective subject, right? But not all plant foliage is reflective. Some of it is more matte, and so it won't catch light in the same way. So we can make it darker like this. And again, we're just adding this nice vignette to the corner of the painting, really making it stand out. Here I'm just using the corner of the brush to do some real detail work. Switch to the other corner once I don't have as much of a fluid pigment. There we go. It's quite nice. Still just trying to diversify and fill in any open spots. But with that, I think we have a really nice corner to our painting right there. Now I'm going to take a step back, just make sure that the values are all what I want them to be, and then we can continue. It's generally best if you can take 5 or 6 steps back. If you can only move 2 or 3, as I'm doing in the studio here, that is okay. It will give you a much better view, but it'll make sure you're not hyper-focused on that one area. Because sometimes we can really kind of only take in the information in that area, and we don't look at it in the context of the rest of the painting. So that might be a fantastic area, but if it doesn't fit with everything else, then it needs to be changed. It's kind of an issue a lot of beginners have, where they make everything in the painting hyper complicated, and it's great because as you work through it, it's really fun. You're making everything as good as it can possibly be, but then when you step back from it, you realize there isn't really a focal point because everything's just a little bit crazy. So we need to learn to simplify different areas. That's why this is so open and simplified. That way that can really stand out, and have these areas that are more complicated and these areas that are more simple. The best paintings are best because they're balanced, not because they have so much detail in every area of them. So that's something to consider while you're working on these paintings. Now, with that, I'm going to move a little bit closer here in the painting, and I'm going to work on this rock right here. So, it'll be a little bit tricky because I have these 3 pieces of foliage in front of it, but that's okay. I'll be careful. The bottom of this rock, it has a lot of shadow cast on it from this rock right here. So this is going to be very dark, but this top area, it'll probably get a little bit light moving in between them. So this will be significantly brighter. So I'm going to start with the brighter pigment because it's easier to mix pigments darker. And I'm going to just add more and more titanium white until this stands out from the backing layer. Just like that. And then I'll start blending it down, being semi-careful of my plant life. There we go. And we can bring it fairly far down, as we can just cover this light area a little bit later on very simply. Now I'll take some Mars Black, make it a little bit darker, come in from the bottom, use the corner and edge of my brush for the sharp lines. You can see how crisp that was. There we go. And you can tell that I'm starting to hold my brush a little bit farther away. A lot of us innately hold our brushes like this, like a pencil, because that's how we learn to draw, and it's how we learn to write, and it's a very innate, easy movement for us. It's great for details, but if you find that your painting's looking a little stiff, hold your brush back here, move more from your body and your arm, and it'll be more difficult to deliver detail, but you'll get something that's much more natural in a stroke, and it'll be a much more fluid painting. So it's something to keep in mind here and there as you're working on these, if you find your paintings looking a little bit too stiff. There we go. So the top's a little bit brighter, the bottom's a little bit darker, and thus we have some depth, which is really nice. These areas are a little bit more flat. They don't have that very dramatic light change because it has more what we're going to call atmospheric light. When you get farther and farther away from your subjects in your painting, the light of your other subjects that are far away have a lot of reflected light on them from, it may be the sun, it may be other subjects, but back here we'll have a lot of blue reflected light, so it's not going to have this dramatic contrast in here like we will in the foreground, because we'll be able to see clearly this where we won't be able to see clearly that. So that's also something to consider. In the background, make things more simple, as the light's going to be much more overwhelming, where in the foreground you have more of those harsh contrasts because everything isn't kind of blending together through reflective color. So, with that said, let's continue working on this here, and let's do 2 of these plants that we have. So I'm going to start with this one because it's a little bit bigger, it'll be easier to warm up on. And this is something I want to be relatively bright, so I'll take some extra titanium white and I'll try and see what this looks like. This will be seaweed. It'll be a nice green color. Here you can see I'm working very detail-oriented areas, and I'm holding my brush again like a pencil. So again, it's very natural even for us who've been painting a long time, and it's okay. But if you do find that you want a little bit more of a loose application, just hold the brush a little bit farther down. It's important to know that you can break the rules, that you're making your art the way you want to. It's meant to be a relaxing, pleasurable process. So if I'm teaching something that doesn't necessarily resonate with you, you don't have to do it. It's okay. We can all make our paintings the way we want to. I'm a big proponent of that. Here I'm just adding a little bit of Mars black in there just to give it a little bit of extra depth. We left those ones as a single value. These ones are a combination of that brighter and that darker value. Now I'm going to work on my greenery right here, and I want this to be much darker. So what I'm going to do, now that I know where it is exactly, I'm going to cover this up and just paint my rock. I wanted to keep it for as long as I could, that way I knew to the best of my ability where it was. And I could kind of keep that mentally in my head. So now that I've painted my rock, I'm going to go back in and paint my little piece of underwater foliage. So here I'm mixing up a very dark gray, and I'm going to do this initially in a series of taps. And as you can see, it's blending a little bit with the pigment we just applied for the rock. So it's not this stark application, and if you wanted it to be a very stark application, let the rock dry entirely and then come back to this. But this will give us a little bit of a softer look, which I'm okay with because it's more on the edge of the painting and I want those really nice, crisp, sharp, standout applications to be more around our main subject. And I know our main subject's in the center of the painting, which is something we don't generally do for compositional reasons, but I'll talk about why I chose to do this in this lesson in a little bit. So here, just have some more of that dark pigment, and now I'm going to tap on all of these little leaves with the corner of my brush. It's very subtle right now. The more I do, the more it dissipates and the less stark everything becomes. So it's important that we remember to go back over the areas that don't have a stark application the way we want. And just like that, we kind of redefined that. I can also take a little bit of this darker pigment and work it back into our other subjects in that general area because they will share similar values. So there I'm just working it into the seaweed as well. So from there, let's continue. And now let's continue with this one right here. I'm going to work it on top of this rock, which we technically should do first because it's farther away, but I'm working in this area. I like those values. I'm like what I'm doing stylistically, and I feel like I'm warmed up. So I'm going to do that. It'll cover that when I do the rock, but then I'll just redo it quickly. It's not a large area. So sometimes we do break the rules of what we do first, and just kind of accept that it means it'll be a little bit more work, but it'll probably streamline the process a little bit in that we are warmed up and ready to do this well right here, so we might as well. And I'll just continue it onto here, that way I know how big it's going to be, and that way I know how big to make my little leaves here. So, working them off to the sides, using the corner of my brush, as we've been doing. going to make sure I cover up all of those open canvas areas that we didn't paint because we were trying to avoid covering too much of this up. I start with smaller little applications and then I slowly build them to be brighter and brighter. I just said brighter and brighter. That's not what I meant at all. I start with them being very small and then I slowly build them up to be bigger and bigger. And that's because it's easier to add size to subjects in our paintings than it is to take it away. Because otherwise we have to paint around them with pre-existing values and possibly gradients. But here, we're just taking this single value and applying it on top of everything else, which is a much, much more simple process. So there we go. That's a nice little piece of foliage there. Fairly easy to apply. If we wanted, we could go back in and add slight highlights to the edges of each of these, but we'll do that kind of in the final highlighting stage of the painting. That way we know that we're not highlighting it too much and it doesn't become distracting in relation to the rest of the painting. Remember, it's very much that idea of not making an area hyper complicated because then the painting doesn't have a main focal point. So once we have everything like our main focal point painted in, we can go back and add extra highlights to other areas that may deserve them. But we'll see. So here, again, cleaning my brush relatively well. And then I'm going to take a step back, kind of evaluate what I want to do next in the painting. And this is a great opportunity for you to clean your brushes or your water if you'd like. You really don't want your brushes drying with that paint, and your water might be getting fairly dark at this point. Mine's more of a middle gray, but if it's getting too dark and you want to work with light pigments, it will dilute them and you won't get those bright pigments that you had on your brush or on your palette. So just something to consider. I'm probably going to wait a little bit longer, but I like to note that as frequently as I can. This is great. Generally, when I take steps back, I find little areas I need to fix. Today, I'm actually very happy with that. I feel like we can just move on in the painting. So, next, I'm going to go back to my largest flat-headed brush. Again, this one is 2 centimeters wide. I'm going to make it fairly damp, and we're going to move into the ground area here, the base. And I'm going to start with a darker pigment in the back, and I'm going to get brighter as we move closer to our seahorse, because we want our light really in that area. But I can't make it too dark. It's not dark like this. It needs to be more like this. So it needs to be just a hint brighter than what we're working with there because it's a hint closer to the light. So I'm going to take some of my titanium white. I'm going to move that to the bright side of my palette now. And I'm going to use that as opposed to this because this is all very dark and getting it back to bright would be difficult. So I'm going to grab just a hint of Mars Black with the corner of my brush. Blend those two together, and then I'll give it just a try. We'll see how close it is to what we have there on the palette or on the canvas so far. It's close. I think it's a little bit darker. We'll work in some extra titanium white. It's a little too much, so now I'll take some more Mars Black, and we'll just work back and forth until we have a pigment we think will work quite well for this. Here, I'll try this. Definitely looks like what we want. Apply it right there just to see. That works well. Going to use the corner of my brush to work around the tail of our little guy. There we go. Nice little tail. And then I'll move it slightly forward in the painting like this. And then I'll run it up the rock we have right here just a little bit. That way I know what colors to work with or what values to work with later. So, as I get closer, I'm going to work in slightly more titanium white. And I do mean slightly. Again, we don't want it to be an incredibly stark change. And if it is too stark, we can just grab a little bit extra Mars Black and work that back in there. Remember, we want to do this with as much subtlety as we can. Paint's very thick right here, which is nice. Won't have to go over it again. And then as I move slightly farther away from our seahorse, I'm going to make it darker again as we get towards the edge, assuming that the light is now dissipating again, and it's going to give us slightly more of a vignette to again move the eye into the middle of the painting. So I'll grab a little bit more Mars Black, work that in, and work on the bottom here. Working around most of my little wildlife. There we go. Chances are I'm going to want to darken this a couple of times, but I'm going to darken it slowly because again, it's just so easy to make something too dark and then have a difficult time making it brighter again. So, got some extra Mars Black, work that in. I'm doing a fairly soft blend right here, but if I have some brush strokes showing through, again, that really isn't an issue or a bad thing at all. Trying to get a lot more of a gradient here. Take a couple of steps back and just see how that turned out. That turned out really well. I like that. It's a little exaggerated, but I think that's okay. In this type of painting, I do like to heighten things visually with exaggeration, so that, in my books, turned out really well. Now I need to continue this land over here, and as I do that, it's going to get darker and darker because we have this rock here that's going to cast a shadow, this edge of the rock's going to cast a shadow. So I'll just take the pigment that I have, start on this side, work around most of these little guys, and then bring it up into the forefront here. We'll have a shadow here from this rock, so I'm making that area a little bit darker. Light's coming in this way, rocks right here, that means we'll have the shadow there. So if the light's coming here, the light's hitting this side's darker, and there's a shadow. Always remember that the shadow's on the opposite side of where the light's coming from. Now this is a very stark contrast, one in which we don't want. So we'll brighten that up again, take some extra titanium white, and we'll just blend that naturally. There we go. Nice and easy. From there, I'm going to work on this rock because it's really the only thing in this area we haven't done yet. And I'm going to start with the brighter top of the rock. So I'm going to start with a nice bright gray. As you can see right here. See how it blends down into this. It's a little bit brighter than what we currently have, that's okay. Just use it for the top here, where the light's really going to be hitting, and then as we move farther to the right and down, we'll make it a little bit darker. So grab some Mars Black now, mix that in. Work around my little sea friends. Now I'll blend it up. And I'm letting a lot of my brush strokes show in this. That's why I'm doing these little tappy strokes. When you do it like that, then you're probably going to get more impressions. And that's actually a good thing here because I want this rock to look like it has lots of little bumps and curves and little natural pieces to it, right? There we go. Can even make some much more prominent strokes up here. Take a bit more of a highlight. Create some interesting line work. I just want it to be interesting. And then we have it blending in with the seafloor at the bottom. There we go. Nice and easy. So from there, I'm going to switch to my smallest flat-headed brush. This one is only 1/2 centimeter wide, And I'm going to use this for the detailed back area and then for our foliage. So this area right here, this is going to be very dark because it's completely opposite to the way the light's moving in. So this is catching a lot of light, it's facing it. This doesn't really have much at all. So it'll be closer to this value right here. So take a little bit of titanium white, I'll take a good amount of Mars black, I'll mix those two up over on the darker side of our palette here. And then I'll start on the edges because we do that, remember, when we have clean paint. I'll blend it around or on top of this. They're very similar values. It does make sense that occasionally some subjects will get lost in other subjects when they are very similar as these two are. And that's okay. It's only natural. Now I'm moving down to the bottom, still working on those edges first. Trying to keep them nice and sharp. This is when you really want your brush to be fairly damp because this is when you want the most detail. But if you make it too damp, it'll be semi-transparent. So it's all about finding that happy medium. Now, of course, we need to finish what we started with this little guy here. So I'll just move that up there, and then I'll tap on some of these smaller implications that this has. We had some of these fun little guys here too, so we'll do those with this small brush. Let us be very detail oriented. This one kind of looks like a cactus, which is fun. I used a very similar value to what we had in there, so it kind of got lost, but we can go in, make the back of it a little bit darker, so I'm using more Mars Black here. There we go, we're defining those edges that are opposite to the light. Now we can go in with a brighter pigment, more titanium white, and create the edge that's facing it. And now you can see it starts to stand out because it has all of this light and shadow. But it doesn't stand out too much, which is good. Going to touch it up a little bit more. Add some little break off pieces. Make it nice and fun. We're working in very wet paint, so creating a harsh contrast is really difficult right now because it's all just blending. If we let it dry for 5 minutes, we'd be able to apply these pigments and they'd be quite stark on it. But because it's so subtle, it'll blend into the background, and we don't want all of our pieces of underwater foliage to really stand out too much, so it's nice to have a little bit of subtlety like that. Now we'll create some darker stuff right here. Don't want it too dark though. And you know what, I think I'll change this into some seaweed. There we go. That looks quite nice. Now, yet again, I'll step back and give it an honest look. So far, so good. Now, we can continue moving on to the painting. If we find later on we want to touch that up, we can do that. But for now, I'm going to work on this little rock right here. So this is a great rock, again, to demonstrate depth. If light's coming this way, this side will be brighter. So we'll start with a nice bright gray. Maybe even a little bit brighter than the gray that we have here on the ground. So take some extra titanium white, work that into our mixture, and I'll apply this on this side. Now as you move to this side here, it's the opposite to where the light is. So take some extra Mars black, work that in, take a little bit of titanium white, and we can make this very, very dark, much like that, because we're getting close to the foreground, right? And when we're close in the foreground, we don't have all of that reflective light bouncing off our subjects and muting them. So here, you can really see all of that stark detail. And that'll bring the viewer's eye to the foreground of our painting. Here I'm just blending around my little starfish. And I'm going to make the starfish quite bright to begin with. Take more of that very bright gray. Want them to stand out fairly well. Using the sharp edges and corners of my brush to do this. As you can see, as I continue, the starfish kind of changes shape a little bit. That's okay. I'm just kind of refining it and moving it to be a little bit more natural. Generally, we don't want to make things that are called a starfish look like an actual perfect star, otherwise it doesn't have much personality, right? So I'm just kind of tweaking it, making some limbs a little bit larger, some a little bit more thick. There we go. That's a good start. And again, if we want to tweak it a little bit later on, we can do that. So, let's move on in the painting now, and let's work over on this right-hand side of our painting. And right here we have the really large rock. It has a little bit of this underwater moss on it. And so because it's so large, we're going to switch to the largest square-headed brush, and we're going to make the edge of it as dark as possible. So right next to a black, we'll have a very, very dark gray like this. It'll be very similar to that. We can kind of test the pigment up there, make sure that it's a good match. It's not a pure black because I want it to be a little bit gray to add color on top of, but it's fairly dark. And I'm going to apply that along the edge here, and then along the bottom here. And then I move in. Then I'm going to take some of my titanium white, put that in our mixture, make a slightly brighter version, but still have it quite dark. And I'll blend that into the sides with a very choppy stroke to give that rock-like effect. There we go. Now when you move the lighter pigment back over this darker pigment, you may accidentally brighten the edges and the back a little bit too much. So if that happens, just take a little bit more of this dark pigment and work it back on top. It's an easy fix. From there though, I'm going to switch over to my medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm going to make sure that's nice and damp. I'm going to create a significantly brighter gray. And I'll layer this more so on the edge. That way it has this real sheen from the light. It's very bright. And now we have this great contrast between the two, really allowing it to stand out and look beautiful. There we go. From there, we're switching to our third brush. So we've officially used all of our brushes in this little subject, and that's because we're getting closer to the foreground. We're working in large spaces, but very detailed spaces. And I'm going to take some of our really bright gray, and I'm just going to do some little taps like this, as you can see. And I'll connect a couple of them. I'll leave some isolated like that. Blend them, but I'm blending them all kind of in this diagonal direction. And this will essentially look like a little bit of underwater moss when we add color to the painting. There we go. We can move the darker pigments back on top if we want. Because all of it's so wet, it's going to be very blendy. And so we're going to have a lot of natural things occurring. We're not going to be fully in control, which is kind of nice. It'll make it look more natural, like nature, and less of our innate styling will show through. There we go. I'm kind of creating bright areas, and then I blend off the edges to be a little bit brighter, but less bright than the middle, so then it kind of dissipates on all sides, and it looks like there's this area that pops out and protrudes, and then as you get down farther, you have the shadow and the darker portions of it. There we are. Can also take this highlight now with a smaller brush and just throw in some extra highlights in other close areas that'll be receiving similar amounts of light. You can tell that even when I'm grabbing very bright values from my palette now, they're not really that bright on the canvas because my brush has all of this darker pigment on it, my water has all of this darker pigment, and the painting itself is wet with darker pigment. So it's all muted to a point here, which again is nice because it'll allow me to add highlight to everything at the end very evenly and with a lot of thought. So that's actually a good thing right there. Now with that, we now have 1, 2, 3, 4 little pieces of different characters under here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with this one because it's a little bit farther back and I have a good idea of what I want with it. I want a neutral to bright gray, so I'm mixing that over on my bright side of the canvas. And this will be a plant. So I'm going to have all of these little pieces of foliage sticking out. I want the foliage to be the biggest in the middle, and then as we get towards the corners and the edges, I want it to really taper and become this small little happy stroke like that. Small little happy stroke. I think a little bit of Bob Ross may have just entered the painting. And I'm going to make the middle of it slightly brighter. Now I don't want the edges to be flat, so I'm going to take a hint of Mars Black, work that into what we just had, and then the bottoms of these leaves are going to be a little bit darker. And I'll make the back of the middle a little bit darker. The front will catch that light and it will be brighter. There we go. Now we'll work on this one right here. And this is going to be quite fun. I'm going to start by layering a base layer with just a single dark layer of paint. But I'm going to tap all of it on, as you can see, like this, in the angle of the drawing itself. So it's essentially just going out like that, kind of directionally meeting the light. But I'm doing this that way if a portion of this base layer is showing through in the end, you'll see that brush stroke and that directional application that I have going right here. And it'll be a really nice extra detail. Then once that's applied, I'm going to take my titanium white, mix up a very bright mixture, apply it to the top there, and then I'm going to create all of these little tendrils, I suppose, moving back into the painting. So as we get towards the edge, they move back towards the middle. As we get towards this edge, they move back towards the middle. As we get to the front, they move back here. And so it's all very directional, and it'll create this nice pattern. Now, of course, as we apply this, It's going to blend with that very, very dark gray which we just worked in. So it won't be too bright, but again, as we mentioned with most of our other subjects, that's really how we want it at this point. There we go. As we get closer to us, those applications can get larger and larger because perspective will make them visually appear larger. The ones that are farther away are generally the same size, but because they're farther away, they look smaller. There we go. Now I'm going to work on this one right here, and I have no idea, to be honest with you, what this little piece of plant formation is, but I saw it in a lot of different, I suppose, pictures and movies, so we're going to paint it. I'm going to start in the same way by just creating this very dark base layer, and right now it's just kind of this abstract shape. It kind of moves up here with a bit of a slant. It's almost like an upside down bell. It's a good way to think of it. Then I'm going to take some titanium white, make that brighter mixture that we used in here and in here. Along the top, I'm going to tap all of these little markings and create almost a line, but have it kind of zigzag a little bit. Then I'm going to bring it in a little bit with those same taps, continue that line, and then create other little lines inside of it. And these are all little pieces that are kind of coming up, protruding, and have this wavy little effect. It'll make a lot more sense when we have color on it, but right now I'm just going to ask that you trust me. You create all of these little wavy lines that kind of touch one another. I suppose you could look again at the image that I posted at the start of the video to see what this actually turns into. Maybe it'll make more sense. It's a very abstract shape and application, but I think it'll turn into something fairly neat. And I was going to add another little piece down here, but I think it's already a very complicated area, so I'm just going to make that a fairly dark gray. I don't want to overcomplicate it. This isn't my main subject, and it doesn't need that much detail. There we go. Now, as per usual, I'm going to take a couple steps back and just see how it's turning out. While I wanted to move on, after I took a couple of steps back, I felt like this was a little bit brighter than what I wanted. We used a lot of titanium white. I expected it to blend with the darker pigments slightly more than it did, and so we could leave it and then just glaze over it later with some darker values, but I think that to see the painting as it should be in the grayscale at the end of this process, for that purpose, for this lesson, I'm actually going to darken it right now. So I'm going to take the smaller square-headed brush, get a little bit more Mars black, hint of titanium white, make that really nice darker gray. And then I'm going to start at the back of this little guy here. And I'm just going to work this in to the brightest of areas that are almost a pure titanium white. That very, very bright value that we have in here. And I'm just softening it a little bit. The same is going to happen over here. I want it to be bright, I just don't want it to be that bright. This was really beautiful. I love how that turned out. That's really what I'm aiming for in terms of value. Starting to lose a little bit of detail, but that's okay. Again, it's not my main subject, and that's not where I need it. There we go. Much darker now, but it still does have some of those highlights. Going to step back, see what I think. I like it. Now it could use a little bit more highlight. And this happens. I'm actually glad this happens. Happens to all of us in different portions of the painting where we just need to go back and correct a couple of times. Goes to show that doesn't really get us anywhere to get frustrated with it. We just need to continue to learn, to try, to practice, to grow. Here I'm just going in with a little bit of a brighter gray again, reintroducing that. And I think we're fairly close. Right now, I'm working more in the middle of my palette, as I'm designating that now is more of a middle gray. There we go. I think that's what I'd like. So, again, for the third, maybe fourth time, taking a step back, seeing what I think, and that I genuinely do like. So, going well there. Now, I'm going to begin working on the left-hand side of my painting, and I'm going to do so with the larger square-headed brush because we're going to start working on the inside of our cave. Now, because I've been teaching this lesson for as long as we have now, I'm going to actually physically stand up and paint. It's generally a much quicker way of painting. You're a little bit more loose, you're using your arm more, and it'll show you slightly different techniques, but I think it'll be very good to see how this side of the painting was painted sitting down versus this over here. This will be more loose, but it'll have more of a fluid motion, which is good because we have all of these very fluid pieces of seaweed. And I'm kind of saying this, I'm kind of bringing this up because we all like to paint in different ways. Some of us like to sit down, some of us like to stand up. I like to paint in both scenarios, and by doing this, by trying half of the painting in either side, then perhaps you can figure out what you maybe prefer and in which areas you prefer it. So I'm going to begin in the heart of my cave. It's going to be the darkest area right here. It's going to be very similar to that. So taking a lot of Mars black, hint of titanium white, and I will test how dark this is by just applying it to that area right there because it's kind of the dark area of the painting. And then I'm going to line this along the edge of the cave right here, right along the back. So again, we don't want a straight line. I'm trying to move my brush in lots of different angles, make it nice and interesting. And then I'm moving it out in the painting. So this is actually quite cathartic. We've been doing a lot of really detail-oriented subjects, and now kind of get to just apply a lot of paint. Just like that. You can see I'm holding my brush from the back of it. Generally that tends to happen when we stand up and paint. Otherwise we have to get very close to the canvas. This is also a great way to paint because it allows you to see the canvas from slightly farther away and gauge how everything's looking as a whole. Now I'm going to work on the other side of my seaweed. Start on the edge of it as we do. Started to run out of paint, so I'm grabbing a little bit more. And I'll just move that out a little bit. But again, we don't want this to be flat, so we need to start interjecting some light into it. We're getting closer to the edge, that light's coming this way, it'll catch the edges of these rocks. So, now I'm moving in with more of a brighter gray. It isn't truly a bright gray, it's just brighter than what we were working with previously. And again, that's kind of the golden rule. When you're making subjects three-dimensional, you generally have a bright side and a dark side. But that bright side isn't going to be the brightest bright you have, and that dark side isn't going to be the darkest dark you have. It's all going to be relative. It just needs to be bright in contrast with the pigment you had. So if it's very dark, your bright side to it could still be very dark. It's just slightly brighter than what you are working with. Going to go over my seaweed for a second here, just so I get a nice crisp line. It's okay, I can see the top and the bottom of it, so I have a really good idea of where it needs to be re-interjected. There we go. The sharp edge of my brush and the corner of my brush are really helping me out right here. Now I'm going to continue with this value that I have right here. out to the edge, and then if I feel like I want to make it brighter, I will do so. There we go. Let's bring it down into the land area here. This is all rock, so we'll give it a sharp bottom, sharp edge. But right there, it looks very flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start incorporating some detail in it. And this larger brush isn't the brush for that, because it is a little bit clunky. So I'm going to switch to the medium-sized flat-headed brush that we have right here. Make sure that it's nice and damp. Grab some titanium white. I'm going to use my pinky finger to brace my hand on the canvas to take out some of that shake that it might have. And then I'll work this very bright pigment over the edge of my rock, kind of bring it in a couple of areas. And this will just be that sheen of light working its way across our subject. Bring it down in a couple areas. I don't want it to just be a highlight on the side. I want it to work in and move amongst these rocks. So here, if you can see an area that's a little bit too bright, I tend to go back and I blend it in a way. There we go. That looks nice. The bottom here though, that's not going to be receiving much light at all. The light's coming this way. This is on the opposite side of that light. So we'll need a much darker gray for that. Starting with the bottom, where it's going to be the sharpest. And then I'll make the bottom as a whole a little bit darker. There we go. Quite nice. Making sure my brush is nice and clean, as we should do. Taking a couple of steps back. And to be honest, I really like it. It's a little bit too bright. I don't want it to be taking that much attention, so we're going to go back, going to suck it up, and we're going to make it a little bit darker. So here I'm taking this dark gray. I'll start from the back area, and I'll just move that forward. Again, this is good that it's happening to show you that, you know what, you can paint for a decade and you're still going to have to go back and repaint things. That it's important, even if it's a big area, to be honest with yourself and say, hey, you know what, is this actually the way I like it? And if not, going in and fixing it is important. You don't want to hang up a painting and know you could have done something to make it better but didn't, because every time you look at the painting, you'll probably think of that and you won't notice all of the amazing things you did in it. So here I'm going in, I'm darkening. Just a process of being honest. Here we go. It's much darker, a little bit softer, but that's okay. Now I'm going to step back again, and that looks so much better. Yes, without a doubt. Now I can make my seaweed much more highlighted. It can really stand out. That made a big difference. And you know what? It didn't take much time at all. So, friendly reminder, going back, fixing things, it's a great habit to be in. Now here, I want the edge to be bright because it's catching that light, but I want it to get dark very quickly as we move to the edge. It's very similar to this right here. So I'll start with the brighter grays, just because again, it's easier to make something bright than it is dark. I want it to be significantly brighter than the dark edge of the cave that we just painted there, so I need to make it a little bit brighter than what I'm currently working with. Again, I'm working more in the middle of the palette because it isn't really bright and it isn't really dark. There we go. And it's important to note right here, it isn't really bright. It isn't as bright as what we have there. But if you look at it in comparison to this, it's incredibly bright. And that's just because it's all relative. It's all about what it's next to. There we go. It's great. Now we'll make the back of it darker. So I'll take some of that Mars black, take a hint of that titanium white, move those two together. Needs to be darker than anything. There we go. Starting on that edge, kind of blend in here at the bottom, and then I'll blend into the rock. And I'll do lots of little short pressure-filled strokes, just like that. When you apply a lot of pressure with your brush, you generally create a brush stroke and it doesn't create a soft blend, which is exactly what you want in this scenario. You want there to be these hard markings, you want there to be brush strokes, that way it does look like rock. If you want something to look very soft, then move your brush very softly over the subject and you won't pick up and move as much paint, and you'll get something that's much more subtle like the background here. But when you want a hard texture, apply more pressure. There we go. That said, a lot of this rock down here isn't going to be hyper sharp because it'll have all of this erosion and all of this water that's constantly moving over it and making it more soft and making it more flat. So that, I think that looks good. Again, stepping back, it has this nice highlight to it. I think I can do a little bit more with it just to add some detail. Kind of move in some of these highlights in different ways. Just like that. Take some of that pigment, move it over here. Just see if we can create some extra little markings. Give it a little bit more of that rocky aesthetic. Can move a big rock like that into the back. Kind of blend it as it moves into the darker area, as the shadow kind of overwhelms it. There we go. That's interesting. So now we have a little landmass right here. I'm going to start with the bottom of it with this very dark gray. We have a lot of little plant life down here, so I'm being fairly careful not to go over too much of anything. That way we still know where we have our subjects. Then we'll make the top of it a little bit brighter. Using the corner here for that real detail work. And then we'll bring it right down. There we go. Going to highlight the edge just a little bit. Just so it has a little bit of that nice reflected light on it. But not much at all. There we go. Like that. Decided I wanted to make the cave a little bit darker right here. Easy to go back and fix areas when you're only working with blacks and whites and grays because you don't have to remix colors, you just need to remix values. Stepping back. Starting to look like a charcoal drawing now, which is always a fun part of this process. So, Now I have all of this detail work I could do here, or the seaweed. I think I'm going to start with the seaweed just because it's a little bit more fluid, and I'm doing a lot of fluid work right here. So I want a lot of the seaweed to be brighter, to have a lot of highlight catching it. So I'm going to work more with my mid to bright grays. So I'm going to mix this kind of in between my bright and my mid-tones. And as you can see, I actually didn't need to mix it with anything. It's already kind of this darker gray or lighter gray. But it's not a white because this has been so diluted. So here, I'm just going to take some of this bright pigment. I'm going to create these edges. I'm only going to start by doing it to 1 to see how it looks, how I like it. Creating these sharp edges with my brush. Trying to do more fluid strokes. By the way, fluid strokes is not intentionally an underwater seascape pun. But if you want it to be, it sure can be. There we go. So, now, time to be honest, time to step back. It looks fairly good actually. I like it. It's a little too bright, so I will work in a hint of this Mars Black. We'll work that more at the bottom here to begin with. And I'm working this on the opposite side of the light. There we go. Darken it up a little bit. I'm going to try doing the next one sitting down, see how I like it. Again, it can make a big difference in how you render your subjects. So it's good to play with different subjects and different painting positions, see what you like. There we go. Going to do my best to cover all of that extra white from the canvas. That means occasionally expanding my seaweed. This is actually much easier sitting down. Kind of counterintuitive. But it just goes to show you, you might as well try. Here I'm kind of making it up a little bit as I recreate this piece right there. And we'll have another piece right up here. I like this more darker to mid-tone gray than I do this lighter gray. So I think I'll tone this down yet again. And I might even make the back of it a little bit dark. Wonderful thing about acrylics, you can go over the same subject 100 times. Not going to build much texture or really hinder your painting. I'll have some little pops of extra highlight on the seaweed there. I think that's nice. In fact, I'll throw a couple just out on these as well. By working back and forth, you can kind of isolate what you like about some pieces, what you don't like about others, and then kind of fix them in that process. What I think I need to do now is, to move forward, I do need to clean my water. I need to get some fresh titanium white paint. At this point, I'm only going to be working with mid-tones to dark grays because this is so dark, because my brushes have so much dark paint on them, and because that is really becoming a little bit messy. So, friendly reminder, clean your palette, your brushes, your water while you're painting, not just at the end. It will make a big difference in the painting, as you can see right there. So we're now back. We have some clean water, I've cleaned my brushes, and as you can see we have some new titanium white on the palette, so we can start working with some true highlights again. So for this next step, we're going to work on all of this little underwater foliage that we have going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work from one to the next, that way it doesn't get too complicated. Now in the very back here, we have one right here, and that's very similar to this. So I'm going to start with my smaller flat-headed brush for detail's sake, and I'm going to put in that dark base layer that we used for the other one. And I'm going to use the smaller square-headed brush by just moving around the lines and the edges of our other pieces of subjects here. And I'm just going to move this out carefully. Then take some titanium white, make a medium gray, similar to what we ended up here, not the bright version that we started with. And I'll just start tapping that on. It's a little bit dark, so I'll make it slightly brighter. Just grabbing a little bit of titanium white, not too much. And there we go. So again, I'm having it all kind of point out from that center area, kind of like a ball. Very subtle, small one. I like that. Next, we have a little piece right here. It's very similar to that one. So I'll make this one a bit brighter. Take the pigment that we already had, interject a little bit of titanium white into it. Work on the edges first. It's a good general rule. And expand outwards. There we go. Now we need to make the bottoms of all of its little pieces of greenery slightly darker. So I'll use the corner of my brush. Be very detail oriented here. And then I'll make a little marking in the back of the center. Because we take the real highlights and we add that in the center. We can also add highlights to the edges that are going to catch the most light, but we don't want that highlight to be as bright as the middle. There we go. Nice and subtle again. Here we have another one. Start with that medium gray for the body. Kind of left the middle there just so I could see where that bright spot needed to go, which we'll incorporate right now because why not? And then I'll throw some highlights on the protruding pieces, just like that. Now right here we have a rock which this, and this are on top of, so we should start by painting the rock. And I'm going to continue using the smallest flat-headed brush just because we do want to work around some really detailed areas here. So while it may not be the quickest to get the job done, it will get the job done in the best way possible. So I'm starting by making the base quite dark. It's the opposite side to the light, so it should naturally be very dark. But we're also working in the corner of the painting, so I want to create that nice vignette effect as well. Now my pigment's getting very thin right there, so I'm going to try to use less water for this next application. And as you can see, that's much more thick. It's less transparent. You can't see as much canvas through it. There we go. just work this around. We're in a very detailed area, so I'm not talking as much because I'm spending more time focusing, just making sure it's right. Then we're going to highlight the edge of it, show that light that's working through. Because we have all of these different rock ledges and things, this is a great painting to really just master wrapping light around subjects. There's so many opportunities to do so. So many subjects to do so. Dark areas, bright areas. Just a great place to learn. There we go. I like that a lot. Now we can start working on the actual little ones here. So I'll start with that one. We'll make it a little bit brighter. So I'm going to start this time in the body and then work my way out. And I'm doing that differently because the edges are all so wet, and every time I work around those edges, I'll bring that dark paint in and I'll dilute what I'm currently working with. And I don't want to do it too much, so I'm starting instead in the middle and working my way out. It's just a more intuitive way of doing it in this particular process. And I actually like how that turned out just like that. I can see all of the brush strokes, they create the leaves themselves, and it just works well. Now I'll create a bright piece of foliage here. There we go. Create lots of nice little leaves on the edges. Because it's so wet, tapping this on right now is a little bit difficult, but again, it'll give us a bit of a blend, and that's nice because we are working around the edges and the corners, and it isn't that true detailed middle area. So we don't want too much detail here anyway. So the fact that it's kind of softening it for us is a nice thing. That said, if you feel like it's a little bit messy, you can always wait for this rock to dry entirely to go back over and add on these little pieces of foliage here. Neither way is right or wrong. All depends on the look you want and how your application is going on. Here I'm going over a couple areas a couple of times just because it keeps blending significantly darker. And again, that isn't a bad thing, but it's just giving me more room to play with it. More room to have fun. There we go. I like that a lot. That turned out really neat. Then we'll have another one of these guys. Kind of looks like a cactus right there. So I'll start with my brighter portion. It's very stark. It's okay though, it won't be that stark when we're done. When we layer in the back of it, the darker side, it will blend to a point, and we'll get something softer. Let's grab a little bit of that Mars Black, work it around the back. There you go. You can already see getting more subdued. Just throwing a couple little highlights. This kind of extends past the rock here, so it should be a little bit brighter. And the same should go for this foliage here. Everything in front of this rock, or above it, is going to be brighter than everything behind or lower than it. So these can get progressively darker as we move down. Go back and add a little bit of highlight to this one. Just like that. And now I think I'm going to throw in a couple extra pieces of seaweed. Just because I really like how this area is turning out, and I feel like if we add a little bit more detail in the painting, it could be really beautiful. And it's great that we're doing this now rather than earlier, because now we know exactly how much we can add detail-wise, because most of the painting minus the seahorse is done. Where if we were adding it earlier, we might have added significantly more than we wanted. And again, taking away paint is a lot more difficult than adding on. So if we wait to add these extra pieces and details, we'll probably have a much better piece for it. That said, again, this is all in the digital sketch. So for those of you who are using that, you already have it all right where it should be. Going to add some highlighted seaweed over here. Something else I missed earlier is this has that nice sharp hard edge, which makes sense, like this, but this has a shadow here, and so does this. That needs a bit of a shadow too. So I'm going to mix up just a little bit of a medium to dark gray. I'm going to apply this underneath, have it taper at this corner, and then get wider as we move towards the back. And this way it'll just look like it has a bit of a shadow that it's casting. Like that. Really pleased with how this is turning out so far. Now, I'm going to start working on my seahorse, and I'm going to begin here by taking some fairly dark pigment and creating a base layer. I'm going to paint all of it, and I'm going to create what's going to look like a silhouette. I'm using the smaller square-headed brush. It's fairly damp right now because I need a lot of precision, and I want these very sharp lines. If they end up being a little bit thin because the amount of water I used is too much, I'm okay with that. I will just go back in and add another layer. It's very much worth that risk to just have those clean lines. I'm kind of making these little C shapes to get those little points on the edges of my guy right here. And then as I get towards the tail, I'm just using the corner of my brush. I'm not using the edge of it because I just want to get as small and as detailed as I can possibly get in that area. Then when I start to run out of paint, I work on the middle area, as you can see here. Just kind of fill it in. And now I'll head back to my water and palette. Create a nice new mixture. And then head back in to those edges. This is going to look really cute. There we go. Take a little bit more Mars Black. Remember to grab a hint of titanium white. Don't want it to be a purely dark pigment. We want a little bit of light in there. Make glazing a lot easier later on. And now I just fill it in. There we go. So from there, I'm going to take some light, some highlight, take some fairly bright gray, and I'm going to apply this on the edges of this little guy that are going to be receiving the most light. So it'll predominantly happen on the top of him. So I'll start with the head, and then I'll do a little bit of a blend down and inwards. Getting the top of the nose here, very important. And then right under the neck will get a lot of light because it's facing upwards, as will the chest. And remember, we can do a little bit of a blend in. Now the light's coming this way, but it'll also catch the back of our seahorse as well. So we need to make sure we get that area well done. Just using the corner right now to get these very specific lines. Now I'm jumping back over to this side. Starting to pop. Take a little bit of time, but we'll get there. Now I'm going back to the tail. You can see that the bright value I'm using here is brighter than that of the background. That way it pops. This is our main subject, so it has essentially the brightest values in the painting and the darkest. And we're incorporating both so that it stands out as well as it possibly can. The contrast between the two will make it pop to the fullest extent. We'll further draw attention to it by adding very vibrant colors in a little bit as well. Now I'm going to have to go over areas a couple of times because acrylic paints are innately semi-transparent. And so when you apply them over darker pigments, they look darker. Because as they dry, you see that darker pigment showing through. There we go. Now we can work some detail inside. They're kind of covered with these little pointy pieces, so I'm creating these little triangles inside that are going to connect from the ones on the outside. So there, I move into a point, I move into a point, move into a point. You see the pattern? It's like creating little waves inside. And then I make the top of its belly and chest a little bit brighter because it'll be receiving more light. Same goes for the tail. A lot of detail-oriented work going on here. Then I'll take almost a pure titanium white, go back over the highlights of the head again, the highlights of the chest again, and of the neck. The bottom part of the neck anyway. I'm holding my brush like a pencil because it's very detail oriented and I want to get this as right as I can. There we go. Paint in a little eye for the guy. It's cute. Continuously just going back, fixing this up. And I created all of those little triangles in the body. What I'm going to try to do now is I'm going to take a fairly wet brush and I'm just going to blend the bottom of it down so that the top remains relatively sharp and then the bottom creates this softer blend. It'll make it slightly more subtle. There we go. Can also move paint around very well when I have an extremely wet brush. Going back and resharpening edges, just making sure looks as good as it possibly can. There we go. Like that little guy a lot. Now I'm going to take 5 or 6 steps back, give it a good look, and decide where else in the painting I can now add highlights, because the most highlighted subject is highlighted. So everything else can be bright, but it can't be as bright as it. And now that we know how bright it is, we can kind of assign other additional brightnesses to the rest of the painting. So now we have a lot of fun in touching up things and really making them pop. So after stepping back, I've decided that there are a couple areas where we can really add some nice highlights, starting with this rock right here. So I'm going to take some of our titanium white, find more of a bright area or clean area on our palette, take just a hint of Mars Black with the corner of my brush. There we go. Work that in there. Make it a little bit brighter again. This is why we want to work in a clean area so that we're not kind of facing all of these other darker pigments. And now I'll throw this on the edge of this rock right here. Move in some different little ways. So here I'm just jetting up and down kind of in this diagonal pattern, but I'm leaving openings. And this will make it look like there's a little bit of light reflecting down on it from up there. I can also throw a little bit on this back one right here too. Now I'm going to take a step up, take a step back. That looks great. Okay, let's continue. Going to grab a little bit more of that pigment that we had. Going to work it on this rock right here. And then I'm going to work it on this rock right here as well. This one has all of our little moss, so I'm going to do this tapping effect. Further brighten that. Bring it out just a little bit more. There we go. We'll add just a hint of it on this rocky wall. Really bring this out. Blending it back a little bit, but I'm keeping the edge that's going off sharper. There we go. Now we'll head over here and we'll do a little bit more of that same effect. So I'm going to start on the edge here with this highlight, and then I'm going to kind of work it back just a little bit in this zigzag pattern, make it look like it has a little bit of light from the waves above reflecting down on it. We'll make this side a little bit brighter as well. It's all very easy with this smaller flat-headed brush. I like to call it a square-headed brush just because I feel like it's a very intuitive name for it. There we go. Move that up to the top. And we've added a good bit of highlights, so again, let's take a step back and just evaluate. Still going well, still well balanced. Means we can continue, we can add a little bit more. Take these highlights, add them to this one. We'll add a little bit more to our greenery, our underwater life here. Now when we're applying this, it'll be much more vibrant and bright because we're not working on top of wet pigment, we're working on top of dry pigment. So now's our chance to really add in some nice details. There we go. Add a little bit of extra highlight to some of our seaweed. Trying to give it lots of little squiggles in there, that way it isn't completely straight or a perfect arch. Want to give it a little bit more personality than that. And I'm also just throwing in some extra pieces here because we have the value, we might as well. There we are. You can also add in some dark seaweed over here. Just like that. Make it cohesive. Add a little bit on each side, right? Yet again, I'm going to take a couple of steps back and you know what? No, I'm not. I'm going to make this seaweed a little bit smaller. I always talk about how it's easier to make something bigger than it is smaller, but you can still make things smaller. It's a little bit more tedious, but I do want that to be a little bit smaller, and I don't want to look at this painting, always see that and think, I wish I made that a little bit smaller. So here I'm mixing up a bit of a darker mixture. Something that should match this dark pigment. I'm coming into the left-hand side of it. And I'm just trying to blend it into the darker background and make this area just a thin highlighted space. I'll try it right here too. There we go. It's okay to leave some brush strokes in here too because it is a rocky area and it'll be a nice look. There we go. Okay, and now, again, standing up, making sure it's all well balanced. All is well, so I'm going to add another detail, very similar to the light that we added here, and that's a light reflecting down on the ocean floor. So for that, I'm going to take that same highlight that I was using, so I have more of it right here. I'm going to make it fairly watery so it's semi-transparent. And then I'm going to work kind of back and forth like this in little Z patterns. And I'm going to connect them together. And this is going to look like light from rippling waves at the top is kind of cascading down and creating this really neat ocean floor pattern. There we go. I'm making it semi-transparent so it's brighter in some areas than others because some waves will be more dense than others. Just connecting all of these patterns, but it's essentially just like a Z shape. Mixing up a little bit more paint, making sure my brush is nice and damp. As we get right under the seahorse here, we can make it even brighter. So I'll go over it with a second application, and because it's all semi-transparent, the more applications we add, the brighter it will get. It can also be a little bit thicker as we get towards the foreground. And then I'm going to have it dissipate and blend completely in as we get into this darker shadowy area. Because I don't want the viewer's eye leading out there. There we go. Going to do a little bit more right here. and stand up and check. That is what's really making it come together. It's a little detail, but it can do so much for the painting. So now, let's add some light into the painting, streaming down. For that, I'm going to take my medium-sized square-headed brush because I want to cover a decent amount of space, but I also want a little bit more control. So for this, I'm going to take some titanium white, mix it in a new clean spot in my palette, and create a fairly neutral to light gray. This is a little bit too dark. Grab some extra titanium white. If I feel like an area gets too paint filled, I might come out to another new area. And I want to make this semi-transparent, so I'm using a lot of water. Then I'm going to come up to the top of my painting, practice making a stroke in the air before I actually do it, that way I have a little bit of practice. But I'm going to try to make some light shine down from the top. So I'm going to start at the top of the canvas, work my way down, starting with a fair bit of pressure when I'm beginning my stroke. That way I get a lot of paint on the canvas, and then I'm going to relieve pressure as I move farther down until it gets almost fully transparent and I take my hand away. So let's do this. Going from the top, working my way down. Going to leave a little opening, then I'll do it again right here. Try to get them on the same angle. And then I'll do another little one right over here. Have it go down relatively far here. We want the most pigment at the top, so I'm kind of taking the pigment from the bottom and moving it back up. And then I'm going to take all of that paint off my brush, make my brush just purely wet, and I'll make the bottom areas very, very thin and watery, like this. Take my hand and just wipe off lots of that excess pigment, making it more and more transparent, giving us really just paint at the top there. But you get these nice strokes, lines of light coming down into the ocean. Here I'm moving it down in a couple areas, back up. Lots of finger painting. Again, I'm a fan. Here you can see I'm kind of scraping this paint off. And I wanted to wait until we were done our seahorse to do this because I wasn't sure how bright I wanted them in relation to the seahorse. I knew I wanted them to be less light, but I didn't know how bright that seahorse was going to be. See how with some water you can just keep moving them about, making it very malleable. I think I can probably even still change the angle. Yes, I can. See, I accidentally took out that middle area though. That's okay. I can just take a lot of water here. And there it is. So you really have a lot of control when you're working with a layer like this, just value on value, and it's pretty much a glaze, but we'll talk a lot more about a glaze in a couple of minutes. Now we have all of these nice little streams of light coming down, very subtle. I'm going to step back again. I think I want one to be significantly brighter at the top here, so I'll take more titanium white. There we go. Top needs to be the brightest. I'm also having them end at different points, so this one's really coming down far, this one ends there, this one ends a little bit higher. You know, to differentiate them, we'll make that one a little bit different, and then this one can come down a little bit farther again, but it's more thin. So I'm trying to make them all very different and diverse, different widths, different descents. There we go. That's nice. Just fine-tuning it. You can kind of see different layers of them now because of what we peeled off with our finger and the brush. And that's really nice. Gives it some extra depth. There we go. Now, these are all very soft. This one's a little bit harder. And because of that, it looks more like a piece of seaweed that's dangling than it does a light coming down. And that's why it's so important that we soften it. We use that water, we go back over it a couple times. And yes, that means it becomes more transparent, but we can build it up as we did the others, should we want to. I think I want that one to remain fairly subtle though. So now, again, taking some steps back, giving it a good look. I think we can add some highlights to the edge of this foliage here. Something I thought about in the beginning, but I didn't want to do because I didn't know how bright this side would be and if we need to balance it. I do like it a lot, so I'll grab a medium to light gray. And then I'll just use the corner of this brush here to add on some slight highlights to the edges that are facing this. I'm not doing it to the other edges. They would catch a little bit of reflected light, but probably not so much that we'd really notice here. If you wanted to do that, you could go in with a really dark gray that's slightly brighter than what we had and throw it on the other side, but I don't think it's necessary here. If you're doing this, make sure that you do really get the edge though. You don't want to be slightly in towards the darker area. You want a very clean, bright edge. Going back over a couple areas to do some extra detail. Extra little taps. And then we can also, if we want, throw on a little bit of detail to the tops of these. So I'm just throwing it on the sides that are receiving the most light, and I'm only doing it in a couple select areas. This will give it a little bit more depth. But again, we don't want a lot of contrast in the back here because it's farther away and it'll have more of that reflective atmospheric light. Just throwing on a little bit, enough to create some extra depth. Again, for the 15th time, taking some steps back, giving it an honest look. And you know what? I think it's time for us to have some fun and start learning about some glazing. So for this next step, it's imperative that A, your canvas is entirely dry to the touch. None of it is even a hint wet. Otherwise, you'll blend your colors with the whites and the blacks. They'll become muddy, and you won't get that thin, transparent, clean color that we need to do glazing. So make sure that you wait a fair amount of time. It might be 15 minutes, it might be 30. Let it dry entirely, and then we can start that. It's also imperative that we clean our water, and we have very clean water, otherwise it will be muddy and diluted. The same goes for our brushes. We don't want any grays left in our brushes to kind of tone down our colors. Also important, I need space on my palette. You probably do too, so now is a good time to clean your palette and get that ready. So let's clean everything up, and then when we're back, I will explain the glazing process and we'll add some color to our painting. So we are back. Here I have some clean water, I have clean brushes, we have a lot of additional paints, and my canvas is entirely dry to the touch. So we are ready for the glazing process. Now, for those of you who are unaware and new to glazing, glazing is simply when you take a pigment and you thin it greatly so that you can apply it on top of your painting and not lose any detail or any values that you've added to your painting. So we're essentially just painting color on top of this and not losing any of the line work. And you can do this by thinning your paint. So we're going to use water to thin our paint here today. I like to use water to thin my acrylics because we use it for every other part of the painting process, and the more we use it, the better we'll get at using it. Though you can go out and you can buy specific glazing mediums for acrylics. I just haven't found them necessary, and I really like working with the water. Now, in regards to our colors here, I know there are a lot. Don't worry, you don't need this many. This is just to give you a lot of option and see and really show you what you can do. But all you really need is a primary blue, a primary red, primary yellow, titanium white, Mars black, and a brown. Burnt umber does work, but I'm going to be using burnt sienna. And let's just quickly talk about each of these right here. I have a titanium white, light blue permanent. This is essentially primary blue with some titanium white. Here we have a cerulean blue hue. This is more of a primary blue with maybe just the smallest hint of yellow. Then I have an ultramarine blue. This is like a primary blue with a hint of red. Then this is simply a primary red. This is a medium magenta. You can mix that out of primary red and titanium white. Here we have a burnt sienna. If you don't have a burnt sienna, you can use a bit of burnt umber, mix in some primary red, a hint of primary yellow, and a little bit of titanium white, and you get something fairly similar to this rusty color. Then I have Mars black. This is cadmium yellow deep hue, and this is a primary yellow. Again, you don't need all of these colors. It's just to show you what you can do if you have some extra ones. So, with that, I'm going to make sure that my brush is nice and damp, take a couple of steps back, just make sure my painting is exactly how I want it. Okay, I'm sure it's time to get into the glazing. So, what we're going to do, we're going to make sure our brush is very damp. We're going to pick a color. Here I'm going to pick some cerulean blue, move it out here on my palette. Also grab a hint of my light blue permanent. I want a fairly light, slightly more yellowy green blue, and that's what this is. This is more of a red blue. And you can't see those other colors in it. It's just a very, very subtle difference. Now I'm going to take a lot of water and I'm going to move this into my mixture until it's essentially like watercolor. Here you can see it moving around. It isn't really the consistency of acrylic paint anymore. And now I'm going to head up in my painting and I'm just going to apply it with my larger flat-headed brush and move it down, as you can see here. I'm essentially working around my cave to begin with, but I can go over that. We can make it much more loose, add some different colors to the cave and everything else in a little bit. But this is essentially the color I'm going to use for all of my bright blues. I'm going to avoid my Seahorse for the most part, so I'm just using the corners of my brush to dodge around it. Just like that. And then as we move towards the outskirts, I want it to be a little bit of a darker, more rich blue. So here I'm going to use my ultramarine blue. Make sure that's very nice and thin. I can blend it a little bit with the other one too to make it cohesive. But here, you can see I'm applying it to the side and it gives it a bit of a different look. And it's just going to give it some extra detail, which is really nice. Here you can see now I'm going over that first little landmass in the background. Again, working my way relatively carefully around the seahorse. If I do cover it up a little bit, that's okay. We will be adding color to it, but it'll be easier if we avoid it for the most part. Now I'm going to take a little bit more of this blue, run it back here. I'm going to avoid the foliage for the most part. I'm going over the seaweed, but I want the colors of these little guys to pop, so I'm being relatively careful around them. Now here you can see that it's starting to drip, and that will happen. Don't worry about that, it'll just give it more of a painterly effect, but if you do find it dripping and you don't like it, you can just be a little bit more cautious, use slightly less water, and then go back in and touch it up with the corner of your brush, as I'm kind of doing there. Now as you move more into the middle here, I'm going to go back to more of a brighter blue, so I'm using the Cerulean and the light blue permanent, making that nice and thin, and we'll just apply this right down here. If you feel like it's a little bit too thick, you can always just take the paint off your brush, grab some extra water, and then find your way back. Again, working my way for the most part around these little guys, being relatively careful. And we're just starting with this blue because it's very easy to begin with. If you go over an area you don't want to, you can just take your finger and kind of scrape it off. It's all very wet, so it's quite malleable, which is nice. Take this, throw it on top of that too. But you can see just how quickly we're adding color to the canvas. Such a fantastic process. Avoiding my star. There we go. That's really nice. Going to work with some of my darker blue on the far right hand side here. My Ultramarine. Has a fitting name for seascapes, doesn't it? There we go. I'm heading over the moss because I intend for the moss to be green, and that's a good color to work yellow on top of. It'll make a true green. There we go. Now I'm going to stand up, see how I've balanced it, make sure I like how it's turning out. I really do. You can see how the darker blue makes that look like it has some extra depth to it, and the lighter blue makes it look like it's kind of popping more. Here I'm just adding a little bit of that darker blue into here just to create that extra depth. Works so well. Now let's start adding in some greens for all of our seaweed. I'm going to take my smaller square-headed brush for this because it needs to be more detail-oriented. I'll take some of my primary yellow, move that out on my palette. I'll grab a little bit of my cerulean blue, work that into it. You can see a nice green. Now make it very watery as we do. Want it to be nice and transparent. And now I'll run this delicately, gently, on top of some of our seaweed here. And it's blending with the blue, which is nice. Going to make it even more of a green. Doing this over both the darker and the lighter bits of seaweed. Kind of stealing some of the pigment from other pieces. That way it's more thin. You don't want your pigments to be thick for the most part unless you're changing something. If you like the base layer, then make it more thin. As we get farther back in the painting, we're going to use less and less of that green, so here I'm just using what's left on my brush. I'm also going to use a hint of this cadmium yellow deep hue to make a slightly more yellowy, rich green, and I can throw that in as well. They work well together. It'll make it a little bit warmer and give it some color diversity. Now let's head over here and do some more. Using my pinky finger to kind of ground my hand, just like we were doing in the past. There we go. Now for the moss, I'm just going to layer on this nice lighter green pigment. And I'll take a good mixture of the two of them for this foliage right up here. Just running it over the highlights. Not too much though, still letting a little bit of that blue show through. I do want some of this nice yellow for this little cactus looking guy. Make sure that he has some over here as well. Make it nice and cohesive. Can add hints of it back here, but I don't want too much. Now yet again, I'm going to stand up, take a couple of steps back, make sure that it's coming the way I want, and it's really starting to build some detail. So now I'm going to go in, work on this little guy and this little guy right here. We'll make that a little bit more primary yellow focused rather than cadmium yellow focused, because we have the green yellowish cactus right there. You can see how it looks as a cohesive unit. I like it. It's a little bit too much, I think, so we will use more of that cadmium yellow. Take a hint more of our cerulean blue. Just work that on top. And I'll use it for some of these little flowers as well. Just jumping around, sharing the color throughout, that way it isn't in a singular area of the canvas. Trying to create more diversity. Now, let's start working in some pinks and purples. So, I'll take some of my regular medium magenta here. Make sure that it's nice and thin. And we'll work that over these more pointy guys. Looks quite nice. This color works and blends so beautifully with blue. Nice to have it in a couple areas. Kind of balances the sides of the painting. Going to add a little line of it in this. Now I'm going to take some steps back and make sure that it's progressing again the way I want it to. So far, I would say all is going very well, but I think we need to start incorporating some additional colors again. So let's start by taking some of our burnt sienna, moving that out into our palette, taking a hint of our cadmium red, mixing those two together, a little bit of our cadmium yellow deep hue, and a hint of our titanium white. Titanium white will thicken the pigment, but we'll make sure to thin it quite well by using a lot of water. This will create a really neat color, which we'll incorporate over our starfish. That was a lot of water right there, so you can see it's very, very thin. I'm just going to move out that watery pigment. We can build more on top if we want to in a little bit, but I really like this orangey color. Take a hint of primary red, a hint of ultramarine blue, they'll mix to make more of a purple. We'll kind of put all of those together, and I think this is the color we'll use to make our seahorse. That's really neat. Going to add a little bit of medium magenta in there. And a little bit more cadmium yellow deep hue. Kind of get these neat oranges. Really want this to pop. Orange is the complementary color of blue, so when you apply them together or next to each other, they really bring out one another and make the other one extremely vibrant. If you actually blend them together, they turn into a gray. So we just want them beside each other, not actually on top. Now I have a fairly thick application here, so I'm just going back with my wet brush and peeling off a little bit of that extra paint. Making sure we have lots of that detail intact. The more paint you add, the more you will cover up the values. So I just want a nice thin layer here. So far, so good. I'm also going to take a little bit of that color and work it into our starfish. That way it isn't in a single area of our painting. We always want to diversify, move it out. And I think I'll make one of my plants on this side that color as well, mixed with the green for a little bit more diversity. Throw a hint of it in there. Maybe add it to the spine of this little piece of foliage. Maybe we'll even make this seaweed have hints of that color as well. Doesn't necessarily need to be realistic. We can move colors around if we feel it will aid the painting. Going to grab a hint of titanium white. Just poke on a little eye there. Stands out so beautifully. Then I want some cadmium red, which we'll use for the middle of one of these plants, maybe two. Add hints of it throughout, just like that. I'll add a little bit of purple up into the rock here. Just make it more interesting. Going to, again, take another step back. I like it a lot. I feel like the sides could use a little bit more color. Right now it's very atmospheric. It has a lot of this beautiful blue, which works, but I think we can make it more interesting. So I'm going to take my medium-sized square-headed brush, grab a little bit more of this very beautiful color that we use for the seahorse, and I'll work it into the rock on the side here. Very subtly to begin with, just to kind of test the waters. That pun was intentional. Some of them aren't, that one was. Just mixing up different variations of my color here. It's a little bit red dominant. I think we'll bring it back and do more of a yellowy pink. If you get too much paint on your brush, wipe it off. You don't need to be carrying around that much. It won't help your painting. I'll also throw a little bit up into the seaweed. Just continue to diversify that color. And that's something that's really fun about glazing. You can create these colors that you normally just wouldn't think to create because you're just layering things on top of other colors very naturally, and they're mixing and they're creating their own new mixes which you wouldn't think to create yourself. So it's really fun. I'll let the top be much more blue, but I'll work in this color more at the bottom. And what this will do, it'll make the top look like it has this really nice blue light, but then as you get closer to these subjects, you see their natural color because it's less atmospheric. It's the same rule as going back in the painting with going up in the painting. There we go. I'm going to take a little bit of purple, take some cadmium red, ultramarine blue, mix those two together. Use more cadmium red, or sorry, primary red, than you do blue, because blue is generally a much stronger pigment, and if you want an even mixture, you're going to need to use, or an even purple, you're going to need to use slightly more red than you do blue. Here I'm just working some purple into this side because we worked a little bit into that side. Looked really nice. There we go. I think I'll grab just a hint of this medium magenta. Work it back into this little one. There we are. Lots of small details. I'm doing a lot of reflecting at this point. I'm doing an application, I'm waiting, I'm thinking about it, I'm jumping back in, but I'm not being too hasty and I'm not doing too much at a time. I've added color to the entirety of the canvas, so at this point it's kind of tweaking and just finding what works best. Trying to change colors of things very minorly. That way, when we applied all of those greens to the seaweed, we don't make it too repetitive. I'm going to take another couple of steps back. Now, I like it a lot, but I think what it's missing is more life. So I'm going to take some of my cadmium yellow deep hue, some of my titanium white. I'm going to mix up a really thick pigment. So we're not glazing with this. And I'm just going to paint in lots of little yellow fish kind of swimming about. I think that they'll be really bright. They'll catch a lot of attention, they'll create extra movement. I'll have them kind of coming from behind this rock here. And these are small little ovals, and then I just put on a little triangle to create their tail. But I think this will add a lot of extra life into the painting, and even some depth as we apply them on top of some of these subjects here. Oh, that looks so nice. I'm really glad we tried this. Excellent. Kind of have them coming from over there. Then maybe they get lost over here, but it's this kind of school that's all swimming in the same direction. Some of them are bigger than others. You can even overlap a couple of them. There we go. I feel like it's so much more lively now. Wasn't part of the initial plan, but you know what? That's okay. We can change things, our painting can evolve and grow. That's exactly what we're having happen here. Don't feel like you need to stick with the initial design perfectly. If you have another idea for the painting, please go ahead and add it. Make it your own and have fun with it. Again, this is really one of my first seascapes that I'm really investing time into, so at least underwater seascapes. So I'm still learning myself. I have a lot of ideas, as you can see, but I don't have all of them. If you are working on the painting and you are a member of the Facebook group for the Patreon Alpine level, please go ahead and share your versions with me. I'm really interested to see what alterations and different things you do with this piece. What other fish, what other pieces of coral or colors you decide to go with. Just feel like there's so much option. Can do a couple little ones in the background here too. Just swimming about. Have one kind of exploring over here. It's important to create pattern and movement, but also to kind of break that and show that these do have little minds of their own. Make them interesting. There we go. Going to take a couple of steps back. That looks so much better. Oh, wonderful. It's amazing what roughly 50 fish can do to a painting. Say that. Can you imagine 50 fish in the context of any other painting? Certainly do a lot. Probably become very surreal very quickly. Here I'm just doing lots of little ones, details. Don't want to do too many, as I don't want them to become the main focal point of the painting, but that's great. Also going to add a hint of yellow into our seahorse, give it lots of different colors. Make it the most interesting subject. There we go. But anyways, there we have it. That is today's hour, but more realistically, probably more like 2 hour long painting. Thank you for voting on this. Thank you for, really pushing me out of my comfort zone to try something new. I'm really glad we did this. I feel like painting the light underwater, especially kind of on that ocean bed, was so much fun. Being able to play with the fish and this turned out so much better than I expected it to, and I'm so grateful that you kind of got us here. So if you are a member of the Patreon Facebook group, please share your versions of this up over there. I'm really excited to see what else people do with this one. I had a lot of fun, and you know what? I have a lot of new lessons coming very soon. I have a couple drawn out on my wall right now, actually. We have a sunflower, I have a cityscape, so lots of fun things coming. If you're new to the channel, remember, subscribe and hit the bell button. I do put out new videos every Saturday, and that'll let you see them. I'm also planning on putting out an extra video pretty soon that has some pretty fun information. So, with that said, thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you're very proud of what you've kind of come up with here today, and I will see you very soon with a new lesson. Truly thank you, and above all, as always, stay creative.